which is a group promoting science-based health education and interventions that result in measurable improvements to the environment. Some of the best studies on the relationship between public health and air quality have come out of Utah as a result of their efforts. Dr. Moench graduated from the University of Utah Medical School in 1977, specializing in intensive care medicine and anesthesiology. He is a former instructor at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, a former department chair of anesthesiology at Holy Cross Hospital, and is now in private practice in Salt Lake City. Dr. Moench.
Excuse me. Thanks to all of you for coming. I think I've been treated like royalty from the people who escorted me here and whose home I'm staying in. And I bring you greetings from Salt Lake City, Utah, United States of America. That's small, obnoxious country south of the border. I also bring you greetings from the Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. I'm their president. And for those of you who question whether or not I'm the president, here's a copy of my birth certificate. Now, some of you may be asking yourself, and rightly so, what is somebody from the United States doing coming up here to Canada when you're clearly coming from a nation of morons up to a nation that appears to have at least some common sense dictating public policy? Now, Canada doesn't seem to invade other countries for no reason. Canada doesn't seem to have the world's worst gun laws. Canada doesn't have a legitimate political party called the Tea Party. So why on earth would someone from the United States come up here to Canada to try and tell you anything about any issue? And I wouldn't disagree with that sentiment at all, especially when we elected this person to be our president twice. And we came very close to electing this person our vice president. And furthermore, recent polls indicate that 27% of Americans think God influenced the outcome of the Super Bowl. 18% of Americans believe the earth is the center of the universe. 1/3 of Texans, the biggest state in our 48 states down below, believe that humans roamed the earth with dinosaurs. Now, I admit that's not a real confidence builder for you to listen to anything that I might say. So I'm going to apologize for all of that, but I do have a perspective that might in fact be helpful to you in this issue that I think has profound long-term, if not permanent, implications for your community. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an anesthesiologist, and as such, I share a great deal of professional enthusiasm with Gene Wilder here as Dr. Frankenstein in one of my favorite comedies, Young Frankenstein. Anesthesiology is the science and the art of bringing people as close to death as they'll ever come and yet still keeping them alive. So when things go well, I have the same sort of professional excitement and exuberance that Gene Wilder had when Frankenstein arises from the operating room table. The theme of Frankenstein, I think, is particularly appropriate for this issue because Salt Lake City, Utah has lived right next door to a living, breathing, unfortunately, Frankenstein monster for the last 100 years. It's called the Rio Tinto copper mine, the second largest open pit copper mine in the world. We have the juxtaposition of this enormous copper mine being within about 15 to 20 miles of literally 1.5 million people. There's no other comparable juxtaposition anywhere in the world. There are some profound implications for our community because of that. Let me share some of that with you. This copper mine, the Rio Tinto copper mine, is the largest source of heavy metal contamination of our air, water, and soil. The EPA, which is our Federal Environmental Protection Agency, that's the acronym, which is the federal agency that is supposed to protect us from all kinds of toxins related to environmental exposures, they estimate that our exposure is about 200 million pounds of toxic releases every year from this mine. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is. And incidentally, the pictures to this backdrop are all pictures of this mine. The Kennecott mining operations are the second largest source of toxic releases in the entire United States. And primarily because of Kennecott, Utah ranks second among all the all the 50 states for toxicity, and the county that we live in, Salt Lake County, is second amongst all counties in the United States for toxic releases. Forbes magazine is not exactly considered an environmental tree hugger magazine. They ranked us 9th most toxic city in the United States, primarily because of this mine. Now, you look at your own community with beautiful pictures like this, and I've been escorted around this community for the last day and a half. I start thinking, my goodness, why would you take vistas that look like this and turn them into things that look like this? Because this is the vista from my house. If I look one direction, that slide I showed you at the beginning, that's what I see. If I look the other direction from my house, this is what I see. Now, I read online some comments from some of your community leaders, and so I wrote them down. I do think they need to be done in the most sustainable way possible. Does this look like it to anybody as sustainable? I read comments like this: there's no question there's an impact while the mine is operating. Well, I've got news for you. The impact never stops. The mine may stop, and likely will stop at some point, but the impact to the community will never end. And here are some of the reasons why. We have a smelter that's associated with this mine. It releases 6,235 pounds per year of lead, and over the course of 20 years, that's 125,000 pounds of lead disseminated throughout the greater Salt Lake area through a course of 20 years. Through the course of 100 years, who knows how much lead has been distributed throughout the community. But lead is going to be one of the things that you're going to have in your community as a result of this mine. Our Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is one of our federal agencies, has stated publicly, no amount of lead exposure is safe. None. Absolutely none. There's not a concept of a safe amount of lead exposure. And yet, this mine pours out into our community over a 20-year period 125,000 pounds of this toxic heavy metal into our community. Now, a lot of you may know that heavy metals like lead are not combustible, they are not destroyed, they actually steadily accumulate in the environment such that the overall toxic burden of the community accumulates and increases steadily year after year after year after year. These studies were published just recently showing a direct correlation between atmospheric soil levels, in other words, dust kicked up into the atmosphere, and blood lead levels in children. And another study showed that in multiple cities throughout the United States, the blood lead levels in children actually go up in the summer months when dust is kicked up, and then they start to go down again. We have proven that lead in soil and in dust actually is translated into higher blood lead levels in children. Well, what really does that mean? It means something very profound. Even tiny amounts of lead are associated with surprisingly large decreases in IQ. Kennecott's heavy metal emissions are a serious issue for our community. This study, published just about 3 months ago, made this very tight correlation. 0.2 micrograms per deciliter of blood is associated with 1 IQ point loss. Now, let me put this in perspective. Medical studies over the last 30 years have shown, again and again and again, that lead is toxic at any level. It used to be considered a safe level of lead to have 75 micrograms per deciliter of lead in your blood. That was the threshold that was considered safe by our EPA. As medical studies advance, we keep ratcheting it down, and so the latest studies show that 0.2 micrograms per deciliter of lead in the blood can be correlated directly with an IQ loss of 1 point. The average person here is probably sitting with about somewhere between 2 and 4 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood and other heavy metals. All of you here are less intelligent because of the lead in your blood, and you think, oh my goodness, lead must be rampant in the United States of America, otherwise why would they be so stupid? But you have a choice to avoid that problem. But this is how sensitive the brain is to the insult of lead and other heavy metals toxicity. 0.2 micrograms per deciliter of lead in your blood is associated with an IQ loss of 1 point. Now, I don't know about you, but every single IQ point that I have, I want to keep. And I need everybody that I'm friends with. I'd like them to have a little more IQ points too. I'd like to have our entire nation have a few more IQ points. You can't afford to lose any of yours. And I think if you look in the faces of your children, you don't want them to lose them either. Rio Tinto's toxic tailings ponds cover an enormous acreage outside of Salt Lake City. If you try and estimate the cost to society of the pollution that comes from our mine, using this formula that was published by our federal agency at about $300,000 per ton of particulate matter emitted. Now, this is an old figure. This is a figure that was generated in about the mid-1980s. That was long before we understood the full extent of the health consequences of air pollution, and it was in 1985 dollars. Their estimate is the cost to society is $300,000 per ton of particulate matter emitted, and this mine, based on this old methodology, is probably costing our community about $4 billion in 1985 dollars. So look at that mine and start thinking of it in these kinds of terms. Now, we have, in addition to the enormous pit and the waste rock piles, we have 9,000 acres of tailings impoundments. This is a photograph of the base of one of them. To put that in perspective, look at that water tower. This is how tall they are. This is how dominating they are of our landscape. Another angle of our waste rock piles. Our mine is so ugly, I'm happy to say that, I mean it's unequivocally ugly, that a picture of our mine was used by Robert Redford in an ad that he paid for in the New York Times to try and persuade the state of Alaska not to build this mine in Bristol Bay, Alaska. He clearly points out, you want Bristol Bay, Alaska to look like this. But this is what I live next door to. Looking for stories of communities that are fighting mines. And I saw this quote from an official in the state of Wisconsin. Mining is the economy of the past. We are repeating the mistakes of the 19th century. Now I'm just going to cover very quickly the issue of acid mine drainage. Weathering waste rock produces acid. Acid leaches metals into the groundwater, into the fugitive dust from this project, from the mine, from the tailings piles, and this process will go on forever. If you let that mine happen, the story's not ever closed. It will go on for decade after decade after decade after decade after they have left. This picture of our waste rock piles is standing about maybe 5 or 6 miles away. 10 miles away from that, all the groundwater has been contaminated. This is the largest contamination of groundwater in the world related to mining. There's nothing you can do with that water. It's absolutely useless for 10-mile distance away from these waste rock piles. So, this is one of my favorite cartoons from the New Yorker magazine. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created real shareholder value. Let me adapt that to this situation. Yes, Kamloops got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created real Ajax shareholder value.
Here, here.
All right, now, I want to then take a little bit of a detour and talk in more general terms about the issue of what are the health consequences of air pollution. And our Medical advisor is Dr. Stephen Colbert, who made one of my favorite statements about Canada. He said, "I don't like to report news from Canada because mostly the headlines are always screaming, everything's still okay." But I will say that I was kind of surprised to see this as I drove through Kamloops. I know our medical system's a little different than yours, but this kind of took me by surprise. I thought, you guys are really doing some great work up here. Then when I saw this magazine in the airport, I thought, gee, this is a real happening place. So I'm not going to sell Canada short anymore. Let's talk about what air pollution is doing to Salt Lake City. This is a picture of our famous Temple Square. This is not a heavenly mist. This is not God's fine, foggy, romantic, Londonish fog. This is deadly air pollution. When it gets this bad, you can't literally see in front of your face, as this photograph illustrates. Well, I noticed that air quality was an issue recently for Kamloops, and apparently that's not only true for just this particular day, January 16, 2013. Air pollution is the result of lighting things on fire. Just about everything you can think of, if you're going to light it on fire, you're going to have a problem with air pollution. Obviously, this guy has a problem with pollution. In the same way, there's no safe number of cigarettes that you can smoke. There's no safe amount of air pollution that you can breathe. This is a graph of what your monitoring stations in the Kamloops area have shown for the last 9 months, approximately from April 2012 to January 2013. This blue line is the World Health Organization's recommended threshold for safe air. You can see that you are already frequently above that. Now, bear in mind, as I talk about a few medical studies here in the next few minutes, you'll hear over and over again this number, 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5. PM2.5 stands for particulate matter, 2.5 stands for the size of the particles, and that's 2.5 microns and smaller. Very tiny particles. So, this is what's going on in Kamloops right now. This is the World Health Organization's threshold for what is considered safe air. You're already above it. Air pollution contributes to 4 of the 5 major leading causes of death: heart attacks, strokes, lung disease, and cancer. Now, to understand how this happens, I think it's worthwhile for us to kind of dive underneath the microscope and look at what happens at the cellular level. If we do that, we see this. Well, you won't see this under the microscope, but this is kind of an illustration of what's going on biochemically. If you look at a cell, that there's an ongoing balance between the antioxidant capacity within that cell and its metabolic needs, which generate free radical production. If you have a deficiency in antioxidant capacity or an excess of free radical production, then this delicate balance starts to shift. And that's when the cell can get in trouble. And if you've got a cell in trouble, then you're likely to have all the organs made up by those kinds of cells be in trouble as well. To be more specific, this is the way it happens underneath the microscope. Here's a cell membrane, nucleus of the cell, intracellular structures like the mitochondria, which is the power plant of the cell. These tiny particles are so small that they can penetrate right through the cellular membrane and start to wreak chemical havoc with the subcellular structures, including getting into the nucleus of the cell and causing this imbalance, which we have come up with a $10 word for it. We call it oxidative stress. You've heard of that term perhaps in relationship to a lot of diseases, but that seems to be the common biologic pathway by which air pollution has its health effects. And in this issue, size is everything. The smaller the particle, the more damage it can do, because you can inhale it more deeply into your lungs. That means you get a bigger dose of it. And then when you get down to those cells, if it's the smaller particles can get through that cellular membrane and start to alter cellular function more easily than bigger particles. Smaller particles are more toxic. But then these particles can also have things attached to them that enhance their toxicity. So the smallest particles we measure we call ultrafines. They're not membrane bound, and so they can get direct access into these subcellular structures like the mitochondria and the DNA and enhance their toxicity, but metals are often attached to these particles as well. And that's why it's very relevant to your circumstance, because all the dust that will be inevitably kicked up by this mine will have a higher concentration of heavy metals than just regular garden variety dust. These metal particles can be attached to these dust particles, and that enhances the oxidative stress, therefore enhancing the toxicity and ramping up the health consequences. And even further, metal concentrations in mining waste particles actually increase with decreasing particle size. That means not only are the smaller particles more toxic because they're small, but it appears as though they also have higher concentrations of metals attached to them. So that's an enhancement of the toxicity you would get from regular particulate matter. Now, back up from the microscope a little bit. This oxidative stress at the cellular level causes a low-grade inflammatory response that affects the entire arterial system. And if it affects all your arteries, then it affects all of your organs, especially your most important organs. And I'm going to put you on the spot, because you were such a gentleman to help us set this up. I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer this question. Name your 3 favorite organs. And don't lie. Actually, this is a family show. Lie.
Heart.
What are your 3 favorite organs?
Oh, my heart.
Okay, that's a good place to start. What else?
Lungs.
Lungs? Your brain, absolutely. You're one of the first people to actually get all 3 right. This is an actual photograph of the pollution that we're subjected to sometimes during the winter in Salt Lake City. This is our city center. So what does pollution do to the lungs? It increases the rates of asthma. Virtually every other lung disease you can think of, including increasing the rates of attacks, aggravating the attacks, increasing the rates of hospitalization. But it does actually more than that, because children who grow up with air pollution are less likely to develop their full adult lung function if they grew up in the formative years between birth and about the age of 18, when your lungs reach their maximum capacity. So it isn't just a temporary situation. It isn't an aggravation of existing lung disease. It actually can precipitate lung disease, and it can actually inhibit lung function, and that effect appears to be permanent. So air pollution is associated with increased rates of hospitalization and death from respiratory diseases throughout the age spectrum, from neonates to the elderly. And the correlation between these outcomes and one of the pollutants, ozone, is still found at concentrations that are as small as 1/3 of what our, quote, national standards are to keep people safe. So the point being that it doesn't take much air pollution at all to start affecting profoundly lung function and precipitating all these lung diseases. How does pollution affect the heart and the blood vessels? For one, it increases significantly the rates of blood clots in the legs, deep vein thrombosis. Within literally about a half an hour after an air pollution spike, blood pressure starts to rise. Now, if I took everybody here and I jacked up your blood pressure about 3 millimeters of mercury, most of you wouldn't feel any of that. But some of you who are on the verge of having a heart attack or a stroke, if that's what happens, then the rates of strokes and heart attacks in the rest of the community start to rise. And in fact, we see that epidemiologically. We see rates of strokes and heart attacks increase literally within hours after an increase or a spike in air pollution. And here's a fascinating relationship, well established now, between air pollution concentrations and the signature outcome of air pollution, which is a sudden death from a heart attack. Plotted on this axis is the concentration of particulate matter from 3 different sources: cigarette smoke, secondhand cigarette smoke, and air pollution. Increasing concentration on this axis, increasing number of deaths on this axis. First thing you ought to notice about this graph is that it never goes down to 0. That means as soon as you get any air pollution at all, as soon as you get any exposure to cigarette smoke or secondhand cigarette smoke, it all behaves the same way. You get any exposure at all, we see statistical evidence of sudden death from any air pollution at all. The other thing I want you to notice about this curve is that the steepest part of this curve is at low doses. so that in a community whose air quality is usually pretty good, and I would say that yours is usually pretty good, if you're on this part of the curve, making it a little bit worse puts you on the steepest part of that curve and has more public health consequences. Now, when the air pollution is just god-awful, like it is for us sometimes, then the curve starts to flatten out. But Kamloops is really pretty much on this part of the curve, meaning increments in air pollution in your community will have profound effects on public health. For every 1 microgram per cubic meter of PM2.5, community mortality rates rise between 1 and 1.4%. Well, that means if you go back to that curve of what your air quality monitors are showing you right now, and you average maybe 10 micrograms per cubic meter, that means that your air pollution right now is responsible for an increase in your community mortality rates of about 10%, maybe as high as 14%. That's the air pollution that you're currently experiencing right now. Community mortality rates stay elevated for 30 days after a short-term spike in air pollution because that inflammatory process doesn't dissipate. There's no threshold below which there's no health effect, there's no safe level of exposure, and our estimation, using the formula published by the American Heart Association, is that in our community as many as 2,000 people die prematurely every year because of our air pollution. And in addition to that, in Salt Lake City, our estimate is that it shortens the life expectancy of every one of us about 2 years. The only part of the body where you can actually look directly at these little tiny blood vessels that we call arterioles is in the back of the eye. As you get older, or if you have diabetes, or if you have high blood pressure, those little tiny arteries throughout your body, but visible in the back of your eye, tend to get narrower and they constrict, and that compromises blood flow. These researchers took over 4,000 patients and they started to analyze, based on how much air pollution they were exposed to, what the caliber of these blood vessels were. And they found this correlation. For every 3 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5, now that's about a third of what your annual average is. A third. That was associated with narrowing of these blood vessels equivalent to 7 years of aging, or an increase in blood pressure of 3 millimeters of mercury. So the blood vessels, the little tiny microscopic arterioles that basically keep you alive and all of your important organs functioning, is very sensitive to this kind of an insult. You've seen this kind of a slide before. Well, this is your brain on drugs, of course. This is your brain on air pollution. Literally, air pollution causes dirty mind. And here's why. Building a brain is about a 20-year process. But the most important part of that process is the first 3 months after conception. That's when the infrastructure, the architecture of the brain is being formed. And just like building a skyscraper, if you don't build the foundation correctly, it doesn't matter what you do later on. You're never going to have a skyscraper that does what it's supposed to be doing. And the brain is much the same way. If during that critical window of development you don't have the opportunity to have a fetus that is protected from environmental insult and the brain does not develop like it should, you can never make up for that. Looking at studies on relating air pollution, fetal development to the human brain, we find these kinds of studies. Air pollution components can penetrate deeply into the brain and kick up this inflammatory response that actually affects brain tissue. And there are a couple of reasons why it does that. One, many of the tiny particles in air pollution actually have, as I mentioned earlier, heavy metals absorbed to them. Heavy metals are particularly toxic to neurons, or brain cells. If we take a brain cell from a mouse and we tease it out and we look at it, it looks like a tree. It looks like a fruit tree because it's got all these branches and all these little blossoms at the end. And the more branches and the more blossoms that that brain cell has, then the more connections that brain cell can make with other brain cells, and the smarter you are. Okay, so you want lots of branches on your brain cells. When you expose animals to air pollution, you can actually see a reduction in cellular complexity, less branches, less blossoms, when you tease out individual brain cells. Then this was a remarkable study done by a group of researchers taking dogs and children growing up in Mexico City, where it's really quite polluted, compared to a comparable city in Mexico where there's much less air pollution. And they did MRI scans of the brains of these dogs and these children. And they found that the children showed, if they came from Mexico City, 57% of them showed these little white dots up here, which you shouldn't see, because they're indicative of reduced blood flow. They are hallmarks of later on neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Almost 60% of children growing up in Mexico City showed this kind of anatomic change. Same with the dogs, compared to only 8% of controls. So we can actually see underneath the microscope, we can see from MRI scans, this actually affects people's brains. If you look at it grossly, this is what an Alzheimer's brain looks like, and that's what a normal brain looks like. We repeat these kinds of studies with mice and find that there's overall brain inflammation, typical of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, just from breathing typical Los Angeles, California kind of air pollution. Now, the brain also has an accessory pathway which makes the brain even more vulnerable to air pollution, and that is, not only can you get it into your lungs and then into your arterial system, but there's an accessory pathway to the brain directly from your nose, in that air pollution breaks down the nasal mucosa here, and those particles attach to the little nerves at the end of your nose, and then they migrate directly back to the brain and can cause direct brain inflammation at the brainstem level. Long-term exposure to air pollution can lead to learning and memory problems and even depression from clinical studies. This is the brain of a normal teenage male breathing air pollution. You might have to look at that one for a minute. However, this is also the brain of any typical male, whether they breathe air pollution or not. This is a remarkable study done on elderly women, which showed that if women are chronically exposed to 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5, again, that's about what you average here in Kamloops. If you're exposed chronically to that kind of exposure, then elderly women are showing an acceleration of the cognitive decline that we normally see with aging, equivalent to about 2 years. So not only is it shortening your lifespan by about 2 years, but it's accelerating the deterioration of your brain by a similar amount. Now we see that actually if a pregnant mother is exposed to certain kinds of air pollution, we can actually demonstrate higher rates of things like anxiety and behavioral and attention deficit disorders in children ages 6 to 7, even if the children don't breathe air pollution themselves, just if the mother did during pregnancy. And the mechanism is probably that it is causing what's called an epigenetic effect, which is something I'm going to get to in just a second. So if you have a teenager that's acting like this, which is the way normal teenagers act, by the way, but it may not be just because they're a teenager. It may be, in fact, that they've had this kind of an insult from things like air pollution. If you take people and attach EEG monitors to them, and then expose them to typical levels of diesel exhaust is going to be a big issue from this mine. We can actually see cortical stress measured by EEG to people exposed to typical urban levels of diesel exhaust. So think about this. Most of the kids who get in a bus, go to school, are sitting in an environment where the diesel exhaust may be 4 times higher inside the bus than outside of the bus. They ride to school for 45 minutes. By the time they get there, they've got cortical stress going on, and they're not thinking as well as they could be otherwise, and long term, they're not going to learn as well. This sort of remarkable correlation showed that modest amounts of nitrogen oxide exposure in children is correlated with a decrease in IQ points, depending on whether or not you're talking about memory or gross motor skills, somewhere between 4 and 8 points, even from modest levels of nitrogen oxide exposure, typically related to traffic. And then this remarkable study from the premier research institute of the United States, from the Harvard School of Public Health. Researchers took 4 groups of children in Boston and then divided them up according to how much air pollution they were exposed to. And they controlled for smoking in the home, socioeconomics, and all the other kinds of possible confounding variables that you might expect. And they found that just based on the amount of air pollution they were exposed to, the differences in IQ was as much as 9 points from the most exposed group to the least exposed group. Now that's a game changer. That's a career changer. That's the difference between being an anesthesiologist like me and being a real doctor like a cardiologist. That's huge. That really does limit what a person can do in life. And this is just from the amount of air pollution that people are exposed to, especially children. Air pollution causes inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, measurable DNA damage, ultimately causing neurodegeneration even in children. And then just in the last year and a half, 2 studies now confirm that rates of autism are double amongst people more exposed to air pollution, for example, if they live close to a freeway. Finally, the area where air pollution may have the most profound effect on human health is what it does to genetic integrity and the development of the human embryo. If you don't remember anything else that I tell you today, I want you to remember this slide. These are placentas from mice that are exposed to, on this side, typical Los Angeles air, and then filtered air, much cleaner. Now you can see there's a difference in the architecture of those placentas. Specifically, there's more congestion over here than there is over here. What's happening is, on the maternal side of the placenta, the blood vessels are starting to constrict. And on the fetal side, to try and compensate for that, the blood vessels are starting to dilate. So the ratio between maternal and fetal surface ratios of the vascular architecture of the placenta declines by 20 to 40%. Well, if the blood supply to the fetus is being compromised, as this clearly indicates, then you can imagine that there could be some real consequence with the development of that embryo. And in fact, we see that. This study was repeated with mice that were exposed to air pollution prior to conception, not even during the pregnancy. They found the same phenomenon, just to a slightly less degree. So the relevant exposure here can actually be prior to conception. So what do we see clinically? We actually have a chemical marker now that indicates that the fetus is under stress when this sort of thing happens. And these are the kinds of clinical outcomes. We see, amongst women exposed to more air pollution, higher rates of virtually every adverse birth outcome you can think of. Preeclampsia, spontaneous abortions, stillbirths, intrauterine growth retardation, low birth weight syndrome, premature birth, and even smaller head size. We see higher rates of birth defects like heart and neural tube defects. Now, again, diving back underneath the microscope for a minute. Telomeres, some of you may know what telomeres are. In fact, to those of you who know, somebody raise your hand and tell me what a telomere is. Come on, you have telomeres in Canada. And I know some of you know, you're just being bashful.
They're the red ends on the chromosome.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Telomeres are these repeating sequences of DNA that serve as end caps for your chromosomes, and they serve the same function as the caps on your shoelaces, which is to keep your shoelaces from unraveling. Every time the cell divides, you shave off a little bit of that telomere so that the cell can only divide a certain number of times before it can't do it anymore and game's over for that cell. Now there's an enzyme called telomerase reverse transcriptase that actually maintains your ability to keep your telomeres in good condition. So if you have an organism that really has lived long past the point that it should have died, but it's got great telomerase reverse transcriptase, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Then that organism can live long past the point that it otherwise should have died, and the best example of that, of course, is Keith Richards. He must have world-class reverse transcriptase. Okay? Air pollution shortens the length of telomeres. If you take a group of people who are occupationally exposed to air pollution, like specifically people who are out in traffic in Europe, directing traffic, and they're exposed to auto exhaust all day long. You look at their cells under the microscope, and they have shortened telomeres. To the extent that we can actually say their telomeres are about 10 years shorter than they should be, based on just their air pollution exposure. And if you're 10 years older than you should be under the microscope, then no amount of plastic surgery is going to make up for that. Air pollution accelerates the aging process. Okay, here's a little factoid, because this is really a dismal presentation. I apologize for it, but you've got to know what the science is telling us, okay? So here's a little something you may not have realized. The average American walks 900 miles per year and drinks 22 gallons of beer. That means we get 41 miles per gallon. I'll bet you didn't know that. I don't know what kind of miles per gallon you get in Canada, but I don't think it's that good. Okay, epigenetics is replacing the gene as biology's center of the universe. I want you to think of it this way. If the violin here is DNA, chromosomes, the genes, or the genotype, then epigenetics is the musician that is playing the violin. The end result, the phenotype, how that organism is expressed, is the music that comes out. If the violin is broken, somebody steps on it, the music is over. You're in real trouble. But if the musician forgets the notes, or if she breaks her fingers, or she doesn't practice the way she should, then the music also is compromised, if not over. Epigenetics has this kind of a relationship to gene function, and the end result can be virtually the same as if you're damaging DNA. Well, how does this purport to air pollution? Researchers from the Columbia School of Public Health have been studying the impact of air pollution on fetal development for about the last 14 years. And they did a study where they took two groups of women and they put air pollution personal monitors on them during the pregnancy. And then they determined through sampling umbilical cord blood the amount of chromosomal damage or DNA adducts or epigenetic changes manifest by white blood cells in their umbilical cord at the time of birth. And what they found is that if women were exposed to more air pollution, you could see 50% more chromosomal changes damage this epigenetic change compared to a group of women who were not exposed to air pollution. This has profound lifelong implications. In the author's words, fetal susceptibility to DNA damage from air pollution has important implications for cancer risk and other developmental problems. Metals like nickel and chromium and arsenic. Arsenic is going to be one of the serious considerations from this mine. They are in fact carcinogens because of their epigenetic effect. Good health requires that all of your 20,000 genes play their proper and synchronized role. It's important that your genes play well with others. If they don't play well with others, you can have some real problems. Air pollution causes an alteration in the functioning of these genes, turning them on or off inappropriately, potentially affecting the lifelong health of people exposed. And here's the key: it can be passed on to subsequent generations. Prenatal air pollution exposure breathed by the mother actually alters the immune system of newborns. And that's probably the mechanism by which air pollution is associated with much higher rates of these cancers: lung cancer, childhood leukemia, cervical cancer, brain cancer, stomach cancer, and breast cancer. I'm going to just highlight breast cancer for just a minute. There's a very tight correlation between air pollution and breast cancer. This study was done in Canada. So if you don't believe anything else I say, believe this study. The correlation is this: an increase of 25% in breast cancer rates for 5 parts per billion of nitrogen oxide. That's a very tiny amount. I don't know what your nitrogen oxide levels are here, but based on what your other monitors show, I'm guessing that this community has an increase in their breast cancer rate of probably similar to Utah's, and that's about 125% increase, just statistically based on the amount of air pollution that you're exposed to. And it's interesting that our air can be considered safe and still have a correlation of an increase in rates of 250%, and that's still safe according to our federal agencies. So that point illustrates the fact that federal standards, and I'm assuming that the same is true in Canada, the federal standards are better than nothing, but they actually do not protect public health the way they should. Diesel exhaust is going to be a big issue here. 2 very important studies show that diesel, in fact, is a carcinogen, has been relabeled as such, and that even typical amounts of exposure in an urban setting to diesel exhaust increases residents increase or rates of lung cancer about 50%. And those who are occupationally exposed to it, like are near these engines, working with these engines, have their rates of lung cancer increased 300%. More air pollution is associated with and likely contributes to the development of type 2 diabetes. Prenatal air pollution exposure, in other words, what the mother is breathing during the pregnancy, is associated with an increased rate of obesity in children after birth, even if the child doesn't breathe any more air pollution. Rates of lupus, juvenile arthritis, sleep apnea, and suicide are increased with air pollution. All of this can be summarized with this kind of a message. A woman's short-term exposure to low-level pollution can affect the health of multiple generations through this epigenetic effect, and the relevant exposure can actually precede conception. And what's critical here is it takes far smaller concentrations of exposure to change the epigenetic integrity as it does the genetic integrity itself, and yet the end result can be the same. So tiny concentrations of pollution insults can actually have long-term permanent effects that can be passed on to subsequent generations. To put this in perspective, some of the most well-known pharmaceutical drugs are therapeutically relevant at tiny concentrations. Cialis, 30 parts per billion. Now, I know none of you take that, but I just use that as a reference point. Paxil, 30 parts per billion. Albuterol, 2.1 parts per billion. Birth control pills, 35 parts per trillion. That's how powerful some of these compounds are. And then finally, we see episodic air pollution actually is associated with increased rates of DNA fragmentation measured in human sperm. So here's the bottom line. We are what our grandparents inhaled. And our grandchildren will be what we inhale. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm here, and then I'll sit down. I had a fairly normal childhood. Not really. My father was a psychiatrist. I had 7 brothers and sisters, and they always picked on me. And now I have post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was the playground equipment in my backyard. Other than that, it was a normal childhood. Nothing really important happened to me then for the next 49 years. Until I got a phone call from my wife in the operating room. Now, that doesn't happen very often. If my wife calls me in the operating room, I know that something's really serious. So I was already having kind of a rough day in the operating room. She calls me up and she says, I have some really bad news. You need to sit down. So now I'm thinking, okay, she has run off to Mexico with the pool boy and taken all the money in all of our bank accounts, and see you later, sucker. But then I knew, A, we didn't have a pool, we don't have a pool boy, we didn't have anything in our bank accounts. So she said, no, it's much worse than all those things. She says, our daughter has breast cancer. So I was obviously speechless for about 30 seconds. Learned some of the details, and what I learned is that she and our daughter didn't think that the recommended treatment was really going to be what she needed. And so she said, will you please study the medical literature with her for the next month so we can find out what to do about it? And so we did. I sat down and she and I went over the medical literature intently, and one of the things we found is that 80 to 90% of cancer is environmentally caused. That has really stuck with me for obvious reasons. Now, 7 of my 12 most immediate family members have had cancer, including 2 of my children, including me twice. So this really puts a human face for me on this issue. And so when things get kind of rough, as they frequently do in the operating room, I think of why I'm engaged in this process, because I had to hold my daughter's hand on her 27th birthday and send her off to the operating room as she went for a double mastectomy. And she said to me, Dad, you're going to be okay. But she's a fighter. I knew she was going to be okay, but I've never been the same since. And the reason why I'm here, and this is a matter of full disclosure, nobody's paying me to do this other than some citizens pulled together some money and sent me a plane ticket. But I'm here because of what's happened to me shouldn't have to happen to you. And it's my obligation to try and help you prevent that from happening to your community. Thank you.